when I was in high school, for instance, people would use an initial and it'd be like J-Dog or T-Dog, or I don't know why dog always. It was
Are you recording?
Uh-huh.
Okay, good. So what was your question?
So, do we have a welcome message or anything planned?
Welcome to Boss Radio, your morning radio show.
Are we officially Boss Radio now? I'm giving up on the three bosses.
It just sounds so great. You know how like a lot of brands will slowly iterate on their name, and then if you look at where they started and where they end up is always the most abbreviated.
Totally. Yeah.
And the same goes for like hacker names. Sometimes a hacker name is the result of years of abbreviation until you get to like something really notorious. Like who is the guy who got put in prison for his crypto fraud?
Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah, so SBF. He went by SBF, which is like the most abbreviated version, right? So I think Boss Radio is more abbreviated somehow, even though it's actually more syllables, isn't it? But somehow Boss Radio feels more, it's two chunks. I don't know.
Boss is a little bit more difficult to say. You know,
Right.
It's funny, like working on the domain, I had told a number of friends and acquaintances that we were going to have this show, Three Bosses Walk into a Room and Nothing Gets Done. And everybody kind of laughed and seemed to appreciate it. When I told them I got this kick-ass domain name, they're all like, oh, awesome, threebosses.com. And I was like, no, actually, that's some marketing agency in Milwaukee or something. No, I didn't get that. But as I was thinking about it, when we eventually got to the .radio concept, if I got threebosses.radio, I was like, well, okay, do people know how to spell bosses? Like, is someone going to try and do BOSSS? Are they going to try and put an apostrophe in there? Like, are they going to spell it BOSSES, which is how I would spell it? And then that got me thinking like, well, but wait, are people going to put the number 3, which is what I was intending? Or are they going to spell it out? THREE BOSSES.
Right.
And so the number of variations that came out of that domain name or that name in terms of possible spellings or ways of kind of hearing it and thinking about it differently, it just creates this domain name nightmare. Whereas Boss Radio, that's it.
Unmistakable.
It's unmistakable. And it's like...
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the perfect compromise is where we landed, which is Boss Radio, which is clearly the better choice for findability, right? And then we still use the three bosses concept in our opening.
Yep.
So like three bosses walk into a room and nothing gets done. And whatever the update is from this week, like whatever the topic or what's been on your mind gets added to the opener.
This week's lack of accomplishments include...
Yes, this week's lack of productivity includes...
Excellent. You know, it's kind of funny. I mean, this is getting off topic clearly, but I have noticed a trend. I guess I don't want to be particularly critical because I don't know the difficulty involved in the work, but it feels kind of lazy to me. I've noticed a trend in writing, especially for TV shows or movies that I've seen, where it feels like the writers of the films that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years might be more inclined to take some classic character's name and abbreviate it to a couple of letters. Just at least from my perspective as an audience member, it just feels lazy. Like you were too lazy to type out the character's whole name every single time, so you just use their initials. And this was like particularly kind of cringy for me watching Disney's Loki, because there's a character introduced called Ouroboros, which, you know, Ouroboros is the snake eating its own tail, which like, okay, cool, interesting name for a character in a time-themed story.
Right.
But then they immediately abbreviated, like literally they spent 2 minutes on introducing him and, oh, you didn't know my name? Oh, how do you know my name? Whatever. And then from then on, they call him OB. And it's like, what? Did you forget how to spell Ouroboros? Like, OB is actually harder to enunciate, I think, than Ouroboros. And there's a lot of names that I've seen, like Peter Parker rolls off the tongue. But calling him like PP, you have to carefully enunciate each of those letters. And there's a number of times I've seen this where it comes out and the dialogue ends up being super stilted so that somebody can say the initials, because clearly that's what was written in the script. But it's not natural to call somebody by their initials most of the time.
Right, yeah. I totally agree. I think there's some initials that work, and then that's why your nickname ends up being the initials, because they just work so well together.
Totally. But I think, you know, a lot of times if you want to give someone an initial-based name, like when I was in high school, for instance, people would use an initial and it'd be like J-Dog or T-Dog, or I don't know why dog always, but it was It was something like that. And it's not their first and last initial. It's whatever, and then some word to make it, I don't know, cool or casual or whatever the spirit is that they're going for. And I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. Actually, I don't even remember how we got on this topic. Oh, Boss Radio. Yeah.
No, it's all right. I mean, I'm glad. This is why I like talking with you, is because I have no one to talk to about like my thoughts on like, why do names get slowly abbreviated more and more over time to the point where they become so abbreviated, and how does one achieve that level? I don't know. I just think it's fascinating that a name gets slowly whittled down to its most distinguishing characteristics, but still taking up as the least amount of room, space, syllables, or concepts as it possibly can. It's like this slowly paring down to the purely functional elements.
You know, it's funny. I think like the incredible thing about language is that eventually sounds stop being sounds for us and they start being meaning, but it's still just sounds. And so we have these ideas that are some degree of, we want to express ourselves to be individuals, and we want to express ourselves to be recognizable or like other things that we identify with. But all of this is just hoping that someone else's pattern recognition matches our own ability to emulate or express it. And that's true in language, and I think it's true in fashion and styles and music genres, and all of it is just, what is it but a pattern?
Yeah, it fascinates me. Two things fascinate me. Have you heard of that phenomenon called semantic satiation?
I haven't.
Semantic satiation is what happens when you hear a word so much in repetition that it loses its meaning. Oh, so here's a word that, this happened to me the other day. I'm trying to remember which word it happened to me with. I think it was an interesting word to be semantically satiated with. Let's just pick a word and try it. It's like bowl, bowl, bowl,
bowl,
bowl, bowl,
bowl,
bowl, bowl.
It starts feeling like bulb or bull.
Bowl. Yeah, it kind of start right. And you start paying attention to like the sound of the word instead of the meaning.
Totally.
And then eventually you don't even know how this word came to have meaning. Eventually you get so confused by like the sound. I'm sure this has happened to you, right?
Like, wonder if you're even pronouncing it right. Like, is the shape of my mouth correct? Am I actually saying bowl, or am I saying some other thing that's like similar but has lost its recognizability?
Yeah. And I feel like semantic satiation happens more if you are living in a foreign country, or if you live with someone who speaks two languages. You start paying more attention to the sound of a word instead of its meaning, and then every day you're like semantically satiated.
I feel like I encounter this somewhat frequently because I have this friend who's been learning English and she wants to get better at English. I think it's frustrating for her because English has a lot of peculiar sounds and requires you to move your lips, your tongue, your jaw, your throat in unison, and then speak with a certain degree of volume of airflow or tightness in your vocal cords all at the same time, and then changing relatively rapidly to produce the next sound. And I think because of the difficulty, and maybe just from American culture in general, I feel like English speakers tend to be pretty forgiving of other English pronunciations, even inaccurate pronunciations, because we're accustomed to hearing things a little bit different all the time. And so our range of what is acceptable for any given word is maybe broader than it might be for languages that are more restrictive.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sounds actually really quickly can lose their meaning and association when you focus too hard on them, because they don't have intrinsic meaning.
Inherent. Right. And what's funny about that is like we experience our lives day to day feeling as though sounds have intrinsic meaning.
Totally.
Right. Like it feels to us, the world feels to us as filled with sounds that have intrinsic meaning.
Right.
In one bucket of the things that we experience as sound. And when we release that assumption, it's a little destabilizing.
Totally.
Dolphins have names for each other. Did you ever read about this?
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, because like what we figured out, we looked at the sound patterns of the sounds that dolphins make. We just looked at the patterns, and then we made these guesses about which pattern might be the name. And then we like emitted that sound, and the dolphin like responded to it.
What?
Yeah, you can go read about this. I'll send you some links.
I'll have to read more into that. I would love to know how they decided on like grammatical structure, because I think this is something that, dealing with potential alien encounters, hypothetically at some point in the future,
sure,
maybe today, we will have to figure out how to communicate. And like the idea that they use kind of auditory sound-based languages is not something that we can guarantee. And the whole structure going to verb, subject, noun, order, or subject, noun, verb. Then there's a lot of fascinating kind of research into this, but most languages in the world, most human languages, follow a very small set of patterns. But to assume even that something that's truly alien would follow a similar format for communication is just not necessarily the case. So there could be completely different ways of conceptualizing language, which the fact that it's potentially so foreign, I think, is what's fascinating.
Yeah.
But also makes it so hard to conceive or conceptualize before we encounter it.
Man, that's such a beautiful short story about this. The Ted Chiang short story called Story of Your Life. It's the story that the movie Arrival was based on. Did you see Arrival?
I did see Arrival, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the short story, is the movie. Oh. If you read it, it's such a great exploration of what would it feel like to study an alien language?
Totally.
And try and figure it out.
I was actually thinking about scenes from that movie. The language is writing through time or time periods, is it, as they're writing? And so it's not the chronology is just completely different from English, for instance. I don't remember the specifics of it, but language and linguistics is fascinating. Somebody was telling me recently that Lord of the Rings was written as kind of a study of language, basically, and it was more about the linguistics. I guess Tolkien was a linguist as opposed to a writer. At least this is what I heard. And so this is why the Elvish and Orcish and whatever are apparently very fleshed out languages.
Right.
And the expression of culture and everything else around it was more about the exploration into factors that would produce the languages that he had defined.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a Tolkien scholar.
Fair.
But that's also what I understood about him. I don't remember. So I definitely can't speak to the accuracy about the part of he was mostly a linguist and less a writer. I don't know about that. He may have been, I don't know. I just never heard that before. But I do remember that Elvish is super fleshed out and that he clearly was a dedicated, inventor of these languages for these worlds that he created. So yes, that's consistent with what I remember.
Well, hopefully we've got a few scholarly fans who can chime in and let us know what we got right or what we got wrong. For everyone else, thanks so much for sharing your time with us today. Next time, we'll be discussing some great topics, including the morality of failure and what constraints can do for creativity. I hope you'll tune in.